So I'm standing next to a stream, and generally what we're trying to do when managing our forests, if at all, when alongside a stream, is basically protect it in two ways. We want to prevent any sort of erosion or sediment from reaching these streams, and we can generally accomplish that by minimizing the amount of disturbance that's taking place adjacent to these streams. So traffic, harvesting, all of that tends to loosen the soil and kind of promote erosion, and a lot of times that sediment's going to end up in our streams, which we want to avoid. So by maintaining cover alongside our streams, we can generally dissuade that type of erosion, that type of sedimentation of our streams. The other thing we're tending to promote alongside our stream banks is shade. We don't generally want to daylight our cold water streams, and then it's particularly important for promoting trout habitat. So I'm standing next to a hemlock, eastern hemlock, very shade tolerant species, doesn't really provide much in the way of timber value, and is actually currently being ransacked by an invasive species called Hemlock woolly adelgid. Now this species, or this particular stem, is not showing any signs of Hemlock woolly adelgid. Generally the big indicator is that you have these kind of powdery or fluffy sort of white puffs on the underside of all of these leaves when we have Hemlock woolly adelgid present. We don't have that currently, but it is a threat locally. Now something that can aid in preventing mortality from Hemlock woolly adelgid in our hemlocks is by effectively daylighting these stems. With more daylight, they become more vigorous, more capable of sort of staving off mortality as a result of infestation. It isn't 100% effective, but it can go a long way in at least minimizing the amount of mortality losses we experience from the Hemlock woolly adelgid in our hemlocks. Now, the species like hemlock is particularly important when thinking about managing our stream sides, primarily because it's one of the few species that's going to maintain evergreen cover year-round. So that means it's basically providing shade with its foliage year-round because it's retaining these needles. If we were to lose hemlock, there aren't a lot of species that can readily replace it as a tree species that provides that evergreen overwintering cover. One of those species that could potentially fill in the void is white pine. White pine is different in its ecology from hemlock in that it's mid-tolerant of shade or intermediately shade tolerant. It likes a little bit of light. It can kind of do okay in these partially open overstories. This tree will likely subsist for a number of years. It's already likely approaching about age 15. If these hemlocks were to die, it's these white pines that would likely replace it. Now, if these white pines were similar in size to these hemlocks and could immediately start providing the type of shade cover that these hemlocks do, if the disease is particularly bad in your area, you could perform a crop tree release disfavoring something like hemlock and promoting something like white pine to still give you that type of shade cover long term. The fear is that in the absence of that crop tree release, you might lose something like white pine to something that's a little faster growing. So selecting something that's white pine, ideally a stem that's larger than this, could get you a stand that still has that evergreen cover along your stream side, providing that year-round shade. Here we're not in any shortage of shade. We have plenty of hardwoods that are providing that, but something to consider is what's keeping these streams shaded maybe in early spring or late fall. So with streamside management, and as far as providing cover and shade of your cold water streams, in this instance, because timber isn't necessarily an objective, and really we're not so much concerned about providing mast for wildlife species, but instead we're really just sort of focusing our efforts on protecting these streams, protecting them from sedimentation and protecting them from being daylit. So in that case, we're really just concerned about functionality. What are these trees doing? And in this case, they're throwing roots into the ground, which is kind of stabilizing the soil, and their crowns are casting shade on this stream. We don't really care who's doing that. In this case, I'm standing next to a sourwood, generally not a sought-after species. One of those species that's sort of on the rise in terms of its prevalence relative to historic norms, mostly because of things like high grading, selecting stems that are not sourwood. Tends to be really sinuous, hard to get a straight log out of something like sourwood. They do accept it as a pulp species, but that doesn't fetch you a lot of value. So in this case, really what we're worried about is long-term survivorship of these stems that are alongside our stream banks. So when promoting crop trees alongside a stream bank, again, focus on functionality, focus on longevity, and where, and if possible, focus on retaining evergreen or carnivorous species that have needles, have foliage year-round, and are capable of casting shade.